Um, and the other good news is that we record our distinguished speakers, and we send out a link to the recording to you afterwards so you can enjoy it again. Also for folks that don't make it, they'll be able to watch it on demand instead of live. My name is Megan Wilden, and it's my honor and delight to be the Executive Director of OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. We provide educational, social, and volunteer opportunities designed especially by and for people 50 years and better in the Berkshires and beyond. All the wonderful thing about our programming is all of it is developed by the members themselves. So we are a community of lifelong learners who contribute their ideas and knowledge and insight to educate and connect with each other. It's a beautiful thing, in my opinion. One of our wonderful committees is the Distinguished Speakers Committee, which is chaired by Hope Hagler. And Hope is here today to introduce tonight's speaker. Hope?
Welcome to our evening lecture. I'd like to share more information about our speaker's accomplishments. Before she joined the faculty at Williams, she received a BA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, an MFA from the University of Arkansas, an MA from Tufts, and a doctorate from Stanford. She also served as a research assistant at the National Museum of African Art, part of the Smithsonian Institute. So let us now learn from our distinguished speaker.
Thank you everyone for being here, and please bear with me a moment while I share my screen with you and get my slide presentation started. Okay. All right, so Hope, thank you very much for the introduction. As Hope says, my name is Michelle Apotsos. I'm an associate professor of art and architectural history at Williams, and I'm here today to have a conversation with you about this particular structure. So this is the Djenne Mosque, which is located in the Niger River Bend area of Mali, West Africa, in an area known as the Sahel, which actually means shore in Arabic and refers to the location of this space at the very edge of the Sahara Desert. And to tell you a little bit about this structure, it's actually existed in one iteration or another for over 700 years. The site of the first mosque was actually in an ancient settlement known as Djenne, which you see here, which was initially established around 250 BCE as a rudimentary market area for largely nomadic groups who were traveling through the region. But when Islam arrived in this space between the 11th and 13th centuries of the Common Era, the first permanent mosque of Djenne would be constructed. And it was actually thought to have been built by a local king named Khoi Kunbro, who may have actually transformed his palace into this first great mosque. As the settlement grew, however, it would eventually move to a more desirable location along the riverbank, and this would become the site on which the current mosque, which is located in the contemporary town of Djenne, now exists. So this mosque is a particularly significant spiritual space for this regional Islamic community, as denoted by its lengthy history and the fact that it's managed to withstand the test of time and the environment. And so because of this, the mosque, as well as a large part of the town surrounding it, are actually currently UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and they've been inscribed on that list since 1988. But the reason I want to talk to you today about this structure is because our current climate crisis and ongoing global discussions about the importance of developing sustainable solutions to contemporary problems has actually led many individuals to start considering ancient structures like the Djenne Mosque, and in particular, the building methods and the materials involved in them as potential models towards rethinking what the future of the built environment might actually look like. And in fact, many actually think that structures like Djenne, because of their ability to not only accommodate ecologically sensitive construction techniques, but also maintain their cultural and, in Djenne's case, religious significance, these structures might actually offer particularly unique solutions to problems of architectural sustainability. Particularly in the context of an increasingly uncertain future where construction actually currently accounts for about 40% of the world's total energy usage per year. And in the United States alone, architectural projects produce around 38% of the country's total carbon dioxide emissions. But to begin this conversation, it's actually important to first position this structure in context, not only in terms of its history, but also in terms of its current reality, and especially its cultural and environmental and spiritual relevance. So, to begin, the Djenne Mosque, as Megan noted earlier, is one of the tallest freestanding earthen structures in the world. And as I said a moment ago, it has been kind of continually in existence for about 700 years. And in terms of this current mosque structure, it stands, as you can kind of see here, in the center of the town, which is Djenne's main market square, where it acts as not only an architectural centerpiece of the community, but also the cultural and spiritual heart of the town as well. Now, the city of Djenne itself is actually home to just over about 30,000 residents, and it's actually located on a floodplain in the inland Niger River Delta that for part of the year actually becomes an island, which gives Djenne the kind of dubious honor of being dubbed the quote unquote Venice of Africa. However, the structure itself, and you can kind of see that here, is actually built on a wide platform that's composed of earthen bricks that sit nearly 3 feet above the ground. And this protects the mosque from erosion, especially over the course of seasonal rains and flooding. In addition, another protection offered in terms of this structure is through the general thickness of the walls themselves. With regards to the walls of the mosque, they range from about 1.5 to 2 feet thick, with denser areas being located towards the bottom so they can absorb the full weight of the structure itself. Now, with regards to the mosque surface, which we can see here, it's adorned with a series of rounded pinnacles, also engaged pillars. And if you can kind of squint here, you'll notice that many of these pillars are actually topped with ostrich eggs that, because of their shape and durability, are actually very good at protecting these pinnacles from erosion. You also see bundles of these palm sticks protruding from the sides of the walls. These are called turon, and they actually act as aerators to wick moisture from the interior so that the walls remain sturdy. And they also function as scaffolding for the replastering and reparation of the mosque surface on a yearly basis, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But another interesting element of this wall surface is how it undulates. And this is actually very significant because it's not only meant to be aesthetically pleasing, but it's also a very effective tactic at minimizing erosion. And that when it rains, it actually disperses rainwater across a wider area, so the structure erodes more slowly and evenly over time. And within this walled space, we also have the presence of 2 rectangular tombs, each of whom honors a local saint, and are positioned directly in front of the Qibla wall of the mosque, which is the wall that faces the direction of Mecca and provides an indication of which direction to pray. So when one approaches the mosque, one travels up one of 6 staircases, 2 of whom you see here, that ascend the platform on which the mosque was built. And they're also lined with this very thick earthen balustrade. And from there, one moves into the interior mosque space. And when one enters the mosque, the exterior world in many ways just seems to fall away in a very sense-based capacity. Specifically, the thick earthen walls inside actively deaden sound and essentially make one feel as if they've been enveloped in this large, quiet, very dimly lit sensory deprivation chamber. And in terms of the dimensions, the interior space itself measures about 50 meters by 26 meters. It also maintains ceilings that are about 12 meters high. And again, just as a reminder, the structure is constructed almost entirely out of earthen materials. So this is quite a feat of engineering. The interior also maintains 90, and you can see them here and to the side here, 90 large earthen pillars that divide the space, kind of like, it's been described as a platoon of giant dominoes, according to Trevor Marchant, who's a notable scholar of Djenne. And this creates a series of very long, narrow corridors that traverse the building in both a north-south and an east-west direction. But the size and the organization of this interior space means that only a certain number of individuals can actually be accommodated within at one time. And this can be a bit of a problem, especially on Friday when a vast majority of the community come together in the space to pray. And so to solve for this, the complex, and you can see these kind of to the sides, the complex also maintains courtyards located predominantly on the western side of this area, but more generally around the space at large to accommodate overflow, and sometimes the crowds even spill out into the marketplace as well. But beyond the physical and spiritual role of the Djenne Mosque, the structure also maintains a very important symbolic role as well, relating to the primary building material of this structure, which is earth. And so to understand Earth's significance with regards to the mosque as a building, it's first important to understand kind of the elements involved in the maintenance rituals that the structure undergoes on an annual basis. So because earthen structures are generally susceptible to water, they often tend to melt over time, particularly in this context after the rainy seasons in the Sahel, which can actually be quite heavy. So in order to maintain their shape and structural integrity, these structures have to have regular maintenance. And so with regards to the maintenance of the Djenne Mosque, this typically occurs in the 2-month period immediately after the rains have ceased. And this is because when the rains end and the floodwaters of the Niger River recede, various deposits of lime and calcium are actually left behind, often in the form of eroded fish carcasses and bones. And when these elements are mixed with earth and actually manure, it creates a very particular kind of plaster that has a number of advantages. So for one, it's actually very, very smooth to the point where it's not only used in architecture, it's also used in pottery. And it's used in these contexts because the resulting forms almost look sculptural in nature. This plaster is able to produce this very kind of beautiful, smoothed over organic aesthetic. But in addition, this plaster is also highly durable. In fact, it's almost waterproof as a result of the different elements that compose it. And this, of course, is extremely important for the durability of a structure like Djenne, especially because of its size. Now, because of the importance of the mosque as a communal centerpiece, obviously, its yearly maintenance is also an extremely important communal occasion, and it's actually come to assume very much a celebration-oriented atmosphere that is also intimately connected to a form of spiritual performance. So along these lines, the replastering of the mosque actually begins on a day that has been deemed auspicious by the elders of a community in consultation with the community masons. And the input of these masons is key, not only because of their professional specialty, they are essentially the architects and builders of this space, but also because of their unique spiritual knowledge of the conditions that are necessary to make this event successful. So along these lines, masons spend weeks studying almanacs, they study lunar calendars, and importantly, they measure various environmental and climatic conditions before making a final decision as to when these reparations are going to take place. But once the decision is made, the word is spread and almost everyone in the community essentially launches into action because the replastering process is also a competition between Djenne's neighborhood communities with regards to who can resurface their designated section of the mosque the fastest. And it's said that the one who accomplishes this goal is seen as being blessed for the rest of the year. But in addition to just kind of, well, in the context of the replastering process as well, another important aspect is that everyone in the community has a role to play. So women typically bring buckets of water to the mud pits where the plaster is mixed by children and then often carried by young boys and often kind of mason apprentices to the mosque. And it's here where Djenne's master masons, which again are the select group of senior individuals who are not only experts in earthen construction, but also know the appropriate spiritual elements that are needed to ensure kind of a smooth construction process. These are the individuals who apply the plaster, and these are the individuals who you see actually on the walls. Now, beyond the physical necessity of this replastering, though, this exercise, this performance, this event is also seen as an exercise in spiritual piety as well, with many individuals praying constantly as they work, so that this act of maintenance not only kind of preserves the structure and encourages the renewal and rejuvenation of communal ties through the collective replenishment of Djenne's surface, but also is in and of itself a spiritual act. And importantly as well, it's also not just spiritual from the point of view of Islam. So along these lines, associations between spirituality, architecture, and the material of earth in this region actually resonate with a number of additional spiritualities, not just Islam. And these spiritualities have existed side by side with Islam for many generations. And importantly as well, many of these spiritualities are also earth-based, largely as a result of the fact that most communities in this area who have not been historically nomadic are generally farmers or agriculture-based individuals. And so along these lines, agriculture and the land, earth have played an oversized role over history in this area, not only in terms of the lived realities of these communities as being, agricultural producing communities, but also in the spiritual systems that would develop in these areas in response to this lifestyle. And so along these lines, in the context of many of these faiths, earth has often been interpreted as the abode of the ancestors, whose bodies are first interred into it. And then from this space, they subsequently bestow blessings on their descendants in the form of good crops, agricultural fertility, things like that. And in addition, many of these spiritual systems also came to be represented architecturally as well. And so here we actually see an earth shrine in the form of this singular pillar that has been embedded in the wall of a domestic compound. And we note too its location at the entrance, which means it was also meant to serve a somewhat protective function as well. But importantly, many of these spiritual systems and also their architectural kind of signals still continue to live on in this area, even in the face of Islamic dominance. And they have been able to do this through different types of spiritual and architectural synthesis. And so along these lines, if we look at the Djenne Mosque, and in particular the numerous pillars that line it, we thus might not only see a structure devoted to the Islamic faith, but also one that makes kind of an innocuous gesture to these pre-existing spiritual systems as a type of shared representative system. And we actually might be able to apply a similar interpretive lens to Djenne's maintenance as well, in that not only does it function as this Islamic devotional act, but also potentially a form of pious remembrance of the ancestors as well, who continue to bless these communities through agricultural prosperity. And so it's through these types of collective symbols that the Djenne Mosque and its associated material earth more broadly really come to act as a focal point around which Djenne society, Djenne spirituality, Djenne identity kind of continues to be renewed and reinforced every year. Okay, but to pan out for a moment, I also want to note that the Djenne Mosque and these various material and maintenance systems that I've just gone over are also contributing something very important to current conversations about environmentalism and sustainability as well, particularly with regards to thinking about ecologically sensitive architecture as being kind of a marriage between environmentally and culturally sensitive design. And so with regards to environmentalism, Djenne's material form in this continuous regenerative process that must be maintained for its survival, in many ways almost positions Djenne as a type of living structure, right? An evolving organism whose renewal, again, not only enables the community to kind of refresh their spiritual ties with the earth and also various aspects of their faith, but also establishes this structure as kind of a living entity that responds to its environment in a very organic fashion, and in turn maintains a relationship with the environment in this very kind of collaborative way. And so along these lines, the form and the material of the mosque actually seem to exist in something of a call and response relationship with the surrounding environment in a number of interesting ways that, again, not only focus on kind of the physical and functional elements of form, material, and space, but also the more conceptual elements of these relationships as well. And so with regards to kind of the physical relationship between Djenne's form and the environment, Djenne's use of earth as a building material is actually significant, not only, again, because of its symbolic qualities, but also because it is actually uniquely suited as a building material to the living requirements of the Sahel, not only because of Earth's ready availability in the landscape, but also due to its thermodynamic properties. So along these lines, earthen buildings tend to keep interiors cool on hot days and also warm on cold nights, which is a particularly useful element in a desert environment. And so in this way, the mosque is very effective at maximizing natural resources like earth, among other things, in the most efficient way possible. Excuse me. But another way in which Djenne is able to kind of maximize this efficiency is not only through the materials that it uses, but also its design process. And so along these lines, the design of Djenne may actually, in fact, take inspiration from a somewhat highly unlikely natural source in the surrounding environment that in many ways acts as a similarly efficient environmental machine for living, specifically kind of targeted to its community. And so along these lines, some have actually speculated that Djenne and other stylistically similar architectural forms in the region may have actually taken both aesthetic and functional inspiration from natural structures like termitaria, which are these tall earthen mounds that function as dwelling spaces for the insect species termite, and often dot savanna landscapes in Africa and also beyond. So to give you a little information about this species, there are more than 2,500 termite types in the world, with more than 1,000 existing in Africa alone. And of those 1,000, many are called macroterms, meaning that they construct large mounds or termitaria that can sometimes reach up to 5 meters in height. And if one looks at termitaria across the West African savanna, one might note, as we can see here, that they do bear a somewhat striking spatial and visual resemblance to architectural forms like the Djenne Mosque, which raises the question of whether there may be processes of structural mimicry and formal assimilation going on here. And so to parse this question further, we actually need to understand the particular type of structural engineering that goes on or that goes into creating a termite mound, particularly within the often harsh environment of the Sahel, and why it might be an attractive model for a structure like Djenne. So with regards to termitaria, these forms are complex to say the least, and part of their ingenuity actually lies in the fact that they are constantly adapting and evolving in response to changing environmental conditions. So to create these mounds, termites actually tunnel downwards into the earth, sometimes as deep as 40 meters, in order to bring up water and minerals for their nests. And along these lines, termites also build their structures predominantly out of this earth, which is mixed not only with fecal matter, but also a glue-like substance that they secrete from their own bodies, which collectively comes together to create this very hard, packed, largely waterproof surface. Yet even so, even though they're very hard and almost cement-like, these structures are still highly dynamic in the sense that the mound itself is actually constantly being renovated and evolved in response to external environments. So for example, numerous channels and tunnels are built into the mound, and these tunnels use natural forces and processes like wind to actively circulate and exchange air, which in turn controls both the interior climate of the structure as well as the level of carbon dioxide inside. So in some ways, the mound is constructed as a type of giant lung. And in addition to this, though, these avenues and tunnels are also variously opened and closed in order to regulate heat and humidity. And the tall spires that one sees, again, kind of emerging from the tops of these mounds, are actually chimneys designed to vent carbon dioxide produced by the nest. And so in some ways, the structure of a termite mound is very similar to that of a living organism, and that it grows and it shifts in response to its environments and its own needs as this very dynamic living system. And in fact, some scientists have even noticed similarities between the spatial organization of the tunnels in a termite mound and the neural highways of a brain, with synapses forming and terminating and shifting in response to various circumstances. So as a structure inherently responsive to both interior and exterior environments, the termite mound is specifically designed to act as a mediator between these two worlds, specifically towards generating a livable environment within. And if this balance is adequately maintained, it's actually thought that termitaria and the colonies within could potentially exist indefinitely. And in fact, there was actually a recent discovery in northeastern Brazil of a 4,000-year-old termite colony composed of a network of over 200 million distinct mounds, many of them about 10 feet high and about 20 feet wide, and regularly spaced at about 30 to 40 foot intervals. And importantly as well, these mounds cover an area roughly the size of Great Britain and can actually be seen from space. So here we see evidence of a highly successful structural complex that houses an equally successful and prolific species. Thus, it might be possible, even probable, that the Djenne Mosque and structures like it throughout the region might look to structures like the termitaria as functional templates for a successful adaptive architectural environment. And in fact, if we compare the two, not only in terms of structural similarities, but also more conceptual connections, this relationship becomes even more apparent. So in terms of the structural, as we can see, the Djenne Mosque, like the aforementioned termitaria, maintains a very thick earthen base that gradually tapers into a series of very delicate pillars at the top. And these elements not only make the mosque appear to kind of grow organically from the ground, much like a termitarium, but also promotes the aforementioned undulating surface form that reduces erosion by minimizing friction caused by wind and rain. And termitaria, incidentally, also incorporate this aspect as well. And then, of course, there is the similarity between materials. So Djenne, like termitaria, is made of earth. And as we talked about, this earth has been combined with specific types of materials, including lime and calcium deposits, as well as manure, to create a solid waterproof surfacing material. And as a refresher, termitaria have a similar material composition, with earth being processed using a substance secreted from a termite's body, as well as feces, to generate a similarly hard, almost cement-like surface. I'd also note that the timbers incorporated into the sides of the mosque, which again, not only act as scaffolding, but also a type of channel for moisture to escape from the interior, are also quite similar in both form and function to the vents and chimneys that termites also use and also build at strategic spaces in the mound structure that not only support the structural integrity of the mound, but also maintain things like humidity and interior climate control. And in fact, the last and probably most interesting point of comparison between these two spaces, especially in terms of engineering similarities, has to do with this aspect of climate control. So the interior of Djenne is climate controlled, not only through the building material, but also through these series of vents that pierce the ceiling and are typically covered with these porcelain tops. And this is almost a direct translation of the spires that often appear in the upper portions of termite nests that are meant to act in a similar capacity. And on top of that, just as the spires and vents within termitaria are regularly plugged and unplugged to account for shifting environmental conditions on the exterior, as well as air quality within the interior itself, the Djenne Mosque also, and you can see these women up here are actually doing this, the Djenne Mosque also seals and unseals its ceiling vents as a way to control and cool air. And so these elements actively contribute to the possibility that there exist fundamental points of connection between structures like the Djenne Mosque and termitaria, not only as feats of engineering, but also as living architectural systems, living in the sense that, like an animate organism, they both engage in processes of respiration, growth, and even evolution over time, and often in response to their very dynamic interaction with the physical environment. And there's actually a term, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that is used to describe relationships such as this, in which man-made structures and systems mimic those in nature. And this term is biomimicry, with the study of such systems called biomimetics. Now, so to focus on biomimetics for a moment, the term biomimetics actually derives from a combination of the ancient Greek term bios, which means life, and mimos, which refers to acting or imitation. And this term is used to broadly describe engineering systems and solutions that are based on imitations of nature, in which natural models and structures are used to solve human problems. And importantly as well, in the contemporary period, biomimetics is actually often seen as offering preferable solutions to human problems, typically because they provide highly durable, adapted models to problems of living as a result of being subject to essentially the most rigorous performance test imaginable, which is time and evolution. And truly, biomimetics has had a huge effect on many of the structures and products that compose our everyday realities. And so just to give you a few examples, in 1941, Swiss engineer Georges de Mistral got an idea for a new technology from seeing the way that burrs got stuck in his dog's hair. And based on that, I'm sure you probably all recognize where the idea of Velcro came from. And Velcro works by taking two materials, one with lots of tiny hooks and the other with lots of tiny loops, and sticking them together. And in terms of other examples, in the contemporary period, engineers are increasingly looking to forms ranging from whale fins to porpoise flippers to make more efficient wind turbines. And even more recently, bat wings have actually become pretty popular as well for their aerodynamic qualities, with the Air Force just completing a prototype for a new robotic spy plane known as the Combat, which mimics the shape and function of a bat in flight that is powered by solar, wind, and air vibrations. And so all of this to say that biomimetics is a very attractive field, largely because designs found in nature have literally been put through millions of years of prototype trials and have survived and in some cases thrived. And so it's probably quite natural to look to these inspirations for materials and designs that are durable, strong, fracture resistant, elastic, lubricating, energy absorbing, and in some cases even self-assembling. And architecture in particular as a field has been very impacted by biomimetic systems, especially in terms of finding sustainable structural solutions that both support contemporary living and also minimize environmental impacts. And so back to the Djenne Mosque may actually represent one of the earliest types of biomimetic design that we know about with regards to its adaptation of structural systems used in termitaria. But with regards to ideas of environmental architecture and sustainability, Djenne in its relationship to termitaria actually has something more to offer beyond just structural and engineering solutions. Because as I noted at the beginning of this talk, one of the reasons Djenne is so interesting in these contemporary discussions is not only because it is an ecologically sensitive design, but also because it is both culturally and spiritually resonant as well. And so to this point, I would note that in addition to functioning as architectural inspiration, termites and their termitaria are also viewed by many cultures and communities in the West African Sahelian region as symbols of fertility and prosperity. And in fact, their nests in conjunction with the earth itself have also been interpreted as the homes of various spiritual beings, with the Igbo cultural group of Nigeria, for example, having long viewed termitaria as the dwelling places of Djinn, or Islamic spiritual entities that are thought to be neither good nor bad, but able to take both human and animal forms in terms of their relationship as being fundamentally kind of connected to the elemental aspects of nature. And to this point, here we actually see a headdress from an Igbo masquerade that may in fact be representative of a termite queen. But to focus on the Igbo for a moment longer, another way in which this regard for termitaria has been demonstrated structurally over time is through an Igbo architectural form known as the Mbari. Now, an Mbari is a very interesting structure. And although it is not known actually whether these structures are still in existence or whether the process of building them has died out, traditionally speaking, Mbaris were built entirely of earth with the exception of their thatch roofing. But along these lines, Mbaris historically are actually very rare. And this is largely due to the purpose behind their construction. So Mbaris were only built during times of great crisis, such as a drought or a famine or some kind of plague or illness that affected the entire community. And this meant that oftentimes one might only see an Mbari maybe once in a generation. But for such situations, Mbaris were constructed as a type of offering to soothe the forces causing these events. And in order to successfully act in this capacity, Mbaris not only had to accurately represent important elements and events from Igbo life, some of whom you see here, but it also had to be built with a very specific material that empowered Mbaris to act in this curative way. And this material was earth. But Mbaris couldn't be built with just any earth. It had to be earth taken from termitaria. And so Mbari workers would actually dig deep into termite mounds to harvest the clay that would be used in these Mbari structures. And this deep clay was actually had a particular term, but translated, it was known as yam food of Mother Earth. Which is a title that implies kind of an intimate connection between the idea of Mother Earth and a termitarium. And the reasons behind the necessity of using this type of earth are important as well. So for one, if we remember, earth in termitaria is extremely hard and waterproof, which is very helpful when building an architectural structure. But in addition to this, termites in and of themselves were and still are very highly valued and respected in this area for a number of reasons. So one reason is because termites actually provide a very important source of protein for individuals living in this area. And in addition, termites are incredibly prolific. One queen can actually produce up to 36,000 eggs a day for a total of 13 million eggs per year. But another important element about termites in relation to Igbo beliefs specifically is that they are actually seen as being sacred beings. They are at the heart of a number of origin stories surrounding Igbo culture, and they are said to be able to bestow blessings on area communities as representatives of the spirit world. And so all these elements effectively acted to charge the earthen material of a termite mound in a way that overall contributed to the effectiveness of an Mbari structure. And importantly as well, this aspect is also seen in the period following when an Mbari was completed and then unveiled to the populace. After this had been done, and after the Mbari's role was said to have been finished, the Mbari would subsequently be left to naturally disintegrate back into the environment. And in fact, any kind of maintenance on these structures was actually forbidden. And this was because at that point, the Mbari's purpose had been fulfilled. Its impact on the surrounding landscape was no longer needed, and thus Mbari should be reintegrated into that environment. And so in many ways, Mbari stands as kind of the ultimate sustainable form, right? But I want to back up for a minute here because there are important lessons to be learned from an Mbari that relate to Djenne as an important example of sustainable architectural form in practice. And that is the fact that it is rarely enough for a sustainable architectural form to merely serve physical or ecological functional purposes. For a form to truly be sustainable or able to progress into the future, it must maintain a type of conceptual resonance as well, whether it is a spiritual resonance in the form of the Djenne Mosque or cultural resonance in the form of the Mbari. In each case, a type of symbolic resonance is necessary to generate the communal connection that will truly enable a form to be sustained into the future as a useful representative example of that community. And so to this point, the final example I will give, continuing the success story of termitaria as a source of inspiration, is the Eastgate Mall complex, which is located in the capital city of Harare in Zimbabwe. So the Eastgate Mall is an office/shopping complex that was designed in 1996 by architect Michael Pierce. And Michael Pierce is actually largely considered to be one of the foremost tropical architects working today. And Pierce's primary concern with this design was how to both minimize the economic burden of the structure by offsetting climate control and other ecologically relevant costs, while also embedding it in its cultural and historical context. And climate control was a particularly important problem here, given the fact that Zimbabwe is largely a savanna region that experiences a wide range of temperature shifts. And these shifts actually constitute one of the primary financial drains in large building projects such as this due to their energy intensive air heating conditioning requirements. So taking termitaria as his inspiration, Pierce subsequently designed a structure that, like Djenne, incorporated both heat-absorbing material as well as chimneys from, and you can see these here, from which hot air could be vented in the evening hours, along with floor vents that enabled cool air to enter in at the bottom of the building through the use of fans. And these fans also actively circulated air through the building during the day to maintain air quality. And so using this system, it's actually been estimated that the building itself uses 35% less energy than 6 typical Harare buildings combined. And it's actually saved the owner upwards of about $4 million in energy costs. But again, climate and environmental impact was only part of the puzzle of this building for Pierce, right? He also wanted it to be culturally resonant. And so to this end, Pierce actually looked to the regional architectural history, all right? Specifically, the use of native stone and masonry in architecture towards making the structure more collaborative culturally. And the specific site from which he would take most of his inspiration would be Great Zimbabwe, which is one of the most revered heritage sites in Zimbabwe. So the term Zimbabwe in the Karinga dialect of the Shona language actually means large houses of stone. And Great Zimbabwe, as you can see here, is actually a large architectural complex that was built sometime between the 11th and the 15th century. And notably, it is composed of meticulously fitted and cut pieces of stone. And so in reference to this site, and you can actually see it more in this image right here, the mall itself has a stacked, heavily carved masonry look with porous surfaces that in many ways is strategically intended to kind of reference the stacking of multiple size stone bricks that characterize the stonework at Great Zimbabwe. And so the Eastgate Mall represents a somewhat similar approach to biomimetic design as Djenne. And importantly, it also references a cultural component that is coming to increasingly guide principles for sustainable architecture in terms of favoring not only good engineering solutions and responsible resource management and utilization, but also social, cultural, and sometimes even spiritual responsiveness. But there's always a but. Regardless of these advances, questions still remain, especially in terms of the long-term success of projects like this from a global standpoint, especially given the variety of histories and discourses that exist, and whether or not an approach like this can be truly universal in scope. And some of this also relates to the fact that different communities may define or interpret environmentalism or even the idea of the natural in very, very different ways, especially in the context of architecture and other sustainable projects. But another aspect of this conversation is the fact that inevitably ideologies of environmentalism and architecture will run up, oftentimes uncomfortably, against opposing priorities. And sometimes these conflicts can even take place within the space of the same building. And unfortunately, Djenne has actually become one of these spaces. So as I previously mentioned, the Djenne Mosque and much of the surrounding town were deemed UNESCO World Heritage Spaces in 1988. And following this, it has become increasingly apparent that local stakeholders, the residents, the individuals who live in this town, and UNESCO have very different ideas and views about what it means to conserve and sustain, especially in a way that is quote unquote authentic to the reality of the town and the mosque. And so along these lines, UNESCO is somewhat notorious for privileging certain regimes of representation and also imposing some fairly strident ideas about both the look and composition of a space according to predetermined ideas of authenticity. And so since its inscription, Djenne's Mosque, in addition to various spaces throughout the city, have subsequently come to be regulated according to many of these regimes. And I'm sorry the picture is so bad, it was the only one that I could find. Along these lines, the mosque and the town were expected to stay materially the same and reject new technologies like ceiling fans that would help residents not only cope with the yearly cost of maintaining these spaces, but also potentially generate new environmentally responsible solutions to building in a changing environment and climate, such as solar panels. And in addition, shifts in architecture and especially the Djenne economy have also caused changes in the materials utilized in architectural construction out of necessity, which makes adherence to certain quote unquote established materials both difficult and expensive. So along these lines, for example, various changing ecological conditions, rain shortages, the fact that the Niger River floodplain doesn't flood near as much as it used to, all of this has actually caused a drop off in the lime and calcium deposits in the riverbed that were used to waterproof this plaster. And so masons now have to incur additional costs towards securing the necessary construction materials as designated by UNESCO's preservation guidelines. And lastly as well, because of the increased levels of pollution in the area, and a lot of masons have had to look towards alternative materials and advancements to generate the same level of quality of plaster. But unfortunately, the use of these materials is very frowned upon, as according to UNESCO guidelines, it contradicts essentially the authentic kind of nature of the space. And so as such, in using some of the kind of traditional materials, the durability and the quality of the plaster used has decreased. And adding to this as well, it's actually also become increasingly difficult to find masons with the necessary skill to do this kind of work, largely because young people are increasingly moving away from traditional occupations like masonry and moving to cities to work in other fields. And so essentially this situation reflects what I might call a museumification approach to heritage, or essentially an attempt to freeze the mosque and much of its surrounding environment in kind of a state of stasis, which actually may have robbed both the mosque as well as its surrounding area as kind of a crucial element contributing to its reality as an environmentally responsive system, which is its ability to change or evolve over time. So enforcing the mosque to kind of conform to certain material and aesthetic criteria, the heritage system in Djenne has in many ways sabotaged the mosque's relationship with the landscape as an ecologically complementary space. And again, by arresting its ability to evolve, this program may have undermined the mosque's most fundamental tool as a living building, which leads to the question of whether the mosque will really truly be able to remain in tune, both culturally and spiritually, with its community in the future. And so in thinking about environmentalism and what that might mean for a space like Djenne. Perhaps we need to rethink what the nature of environmentalism entails and maybe how it can be made more inclusive and intersectional. And what I mean by these terms is that environmentalism needs to recognize and privilege the diverse ways in which communities individually encounter and define environmental concerns, and incorporate natural design elements in a way that generates kind of structural responses and solutions, both appropriate and specific to that context. And along these lines, an inclusive environmentalism can really only emerge when it's informed by multiple perspectives and concerns. And this is a process that in turn not only generates equity between kind of humanity and the natural world, but also makes the two quite naturally synergistic. And so along these lines, conversations about environmentalism within the context of the Djenne Mosque also need to reference the fact that Islam itself is actually very much an ecologically sensitive system of belief. And in fact, one of the most often cited surahs or chapters in the Islamic holy text, the Quran, with regards to environmentalism, states that corruption has appeared on the land and in the sea because of what the hands of humans have wrought. That the earth is a divine creation is a fundamental tenet that has long occupied a central position in Islamic philosophy and belief systems. And these philosophies have actually increasingly informed a movement that has come to be called the Green Deen, which essentially positions environmental responsibility as faith-based practice. And this movement finds much support and is actually taken largely in the context of Islam's primary sacred text, both the Quran and the Hadiths, which each have long expressed concern with regards to the impact of human behavior on natural systems around the world. And so along these lines, the specific principles through which Muslim life is governed with regards to the environment can be found in a number of key statements, especially sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who declared in Hadith 10:10 that the world is beautiful and verdant, and verily Allah, may he exalted, has made you his stewards in it, and as he sees how you acquit yourselves. Likewise, the Quran also notes that all creations of God exist in a state of remembrance to the Almighty. The implication being that all of God's creations are in a constant state of prayer, and that the entire earth is essentially mosque space and should be treated with respect. And there are also fundamental principles within the faith that are intimately and naturally implicated in one's harmonious relationship with the environment. And these principles have been largely explored in the work of contemporary Islamic environmentalist scholar Sayyid Hossein Nasr, who is an Iranian philosopher and is typically considered one of the most important Islamic intellectuals of the contemporary era, and has published widely on subjects that position Muslim philosophical doctrine within environmentalist discourse. And importantly, scholars like Nasr point out the fact that there has been very little recognition of the extensive connections that have long existed between religious systems writ large and nature, when in fact the philosophical nature of many of these systems has a lot to offer studies of ecology. And with regards to Islam, in thinking through environmentalism as a spiritual issue, religions like Islam subsequently position nature not only as a creation of God and thus worthy of protection and veneration, but also as a religious principle through which to govern one's own religious practice and material impact on the world. But even more importantly, Nasr also notes that nature and the environment are sacred spaces precisely because they are always in danger of desecration. And so because of this, in the mid-1960s, Nasr actually began producing a series of lectures at the University of Chicago designed to address kind of this intimate relationship between man and the natural environment from a faith-based perspective. And this would actually eventually become the basis for his book, Man and Nature, The Spiritual Crisis of Modern Man, which was published in 1976. And so this volume not only essentially established Nasr as kind of the quote unquote, the father of modern Muslim environmentalism, but also the founder of a contemporary view of Islam that might be called Muslim eco-theology, which essentially takes its philosophy from sources like the Quran and uses this content to provide directives for the faithful with regards to their treatment of and interaction with the natural environment. And importantly, the elements of Muslim eco-theology revolve around several central tenets of the Islamic faith. So the first of these, Tawheed, holds that the oneness of God with his creations means that his creations, namely nature and the earth, should receive commensurate respect. The second, Fitra, is understood as relating to the original state of creation or the original nature of things, implying that if humans are to live in a state of Fitra, they must exist in natural harmony with the environment and subsequently take steps to uphold that existence. The third tenet involves the role of the faithful as Khalifa, or stewards of God's creation, meaning that humans have a responsibility to care for the earth based on the trust that God has given them. And this plays into the final idea of amana, which represents the fulfillment of responsibility to God in all dimensions of life. Thus, as stewards of God's creation, the faithful in their role as servants of God must respect natural laws, which include the care of nature, its ecosystems, and its resources as one's ordained obligation. But in addition to being the stewards of God's creation, the faithful also occupy the role of servants to God, okay, which in many ways places limits on the power of humankind as God's stewards. And Muslim eco-theologists have interpreted this to mean that Muslims in their role as servants of God have to obey natural laws, okay? Which again includes the care of nature and so on and so forth. And all of this plays into one final tenet, which is the concept of mizan, or balance, which interpreted through an eco-theological lens implies ecological balance and thus the careful management and, if needed, restoration of nature to balance out anthropogenic effects. And again, importantly, the driving motivation behind these eco-theological premises is to honor God through the honoring of nature as a type of devotional act. And this is why Nasser and other Islamic environmentalists have really emphasized a return to spiritual life as a mode of countering the current environmental situation, in that modern secular life, which has come to be defined so much by consumerism and kind of immoderate behaviors, has largely brought about our current kind of environmental state. And so bringing this back to Djenne, this also plays into the performative act that is most connected with the honoring of God, which is prayer, and the importance of the natural environment and establishing space for this act in the form of the mosque. And so along these lines, Hadith 1057 records the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as saying, "Wherever you may be at the time of prayer, you may pray, for all the earth is a mosque." And likewise, this hadith also supports the broader belief that the earth is in fact a divine manifestation, with the implications for mosques being that in the absence of a man-made enclosure set aside for worship, the immense structural dome of the sky can be perceived as kind of the symbolic architectural form, which encompasses the worshiper within this sacred space. And so the implications of this are very simple. The earth is a mosque, the mosque is sacred, therefore the earth is sacred. And all of this, of course, resonates strongly with the nature of the Djenne Mosque, whose earthen form, both physically and symbolically, seems to embody many of these tenets as both physical and symbolic elements. And in addition, when thinking of structures like the Djenne Mosque as a type of natural architecture that takes creations like the termite mound as its primary inspiration, its distinctive symbolic language actually becomes a type of experience through which one not only engages with the sacred as a type of affirmation of the faith, but also as kind of an intimate individual act that enables one to partake in communions with God through this space and nature as God's creation. And so Djenne, in some ways, represents almost an evolution of the natural environment, kind of a spatial appendage whose materials, were derived from nature and reassembled to create a space kind of mutually constitutive of natural and man-made systems. And so here we have a structure that is both theologically and practically grounded in what might be termed a philosophy of Eco-Islamicism. And this is one of the reasons that Djenne, again, is receiving increased attention on this end. It stands as a locally informed, sustainable example of environmentally respectful spirituality and a comprehensive architectural approach to sustainability. But it also compels one to question, what exactly does it mean to create a sustainable built environment? What do such environments look like? And do they look the same for different people across different times and spaces? And if we define sustainability as the endurance of systems or processes, which is its basic definition, we can't just focus on the environmental, but we also need to take into account the cultural, the political, the social, and of course the spiritual as well. Because it's in recognizing the relationship between the way things are constructed and the deeper conceptual meanings behind the languages deployed that environmentalism becomes realized as a fundamentally context-specific ideal, and its manifestation within the architectural environment, essentially a mode of producing dialogue and conversation about the desired trajectory of both cultural, environmental, and structural worlds into the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Apotsos. That was an amazing talk that brought together so many different strands. So, gosh, thank you. And I'm sure that there's lots of questions and comments from our attendees. You can use the chat function to put those in. We do have one from Lewis. He asks if there are other examples of Mali indigenous architecture that may have influenced the design and construction of the Djenne Mosque.
That's a really good question. And interestingly, not really. So the style of architecture that the Djenne Mosque is kind of a part of has been called kind of problematically the Sudanese style of architecture. And it's a style of architecture that emerged between the 9th and the 13th centuries when Islam first came into this area of the Sahel. And the Islam that came into this area was actually an Islam that was coming from North Africa, specifically areas like Morocco, who had their own very particular type of mosque styles that were largely related to kind of southern Spain and, you know, Egyptian styles. But when Islam moved into the area of the Niger River, it really took on a form of its own, largely because Islam was being confronted with a number of these already established spiritual identities. And, you know, Islamic individuals being smart realized that the best way, if you can't beat them, join them. And so along these lines, you had a number of local leaders building these structures that not only referenced Islam through kind of their functional identity, but also referenced a lot of these other kind of area architectural traditions as kind of a nod and kind of a gesture of respect. So it really did become kind of a singular type of style. And it would go on to inform a number of mosques, both in Mali and also a little further south into spaces like Nigeria and Ghana and places like that.
Great, thank you so much. And again, I'm encouraging folks to add their comments and questions. I had a question about the whole UNESCO, you know, trying to save places and by doing so, maybe aiding their discussion. I was wondering if you could tell us what other examples of that are there that you know, is this a widespread concern and experience?
It's a really good question, and I will admit that my answer might be a little biased. But along these lines, I think you tend to see more of this type of, for lack of a better word, preservation-oriented imperialism, especially in spaces like Africa largely because there is a sense, there has historically been a sense that preservation, conservation, and different priorities related to the two often don't align. So for example, to give you another example, in Ghana, there are also a number of kind of similar types of mosques in this area. Critère, in conjunction or kind of in conversation with UNESCO, Critère is actually a French earthen architecture organization that does a lot of work in spaces like West Africa, who have strong traditions. Critère actually came into a specific community down there who had a mosque that needed kind of renovation, and proceeded to kind of impose an idea about what the mosque should look like in terms of both the material used and also the surface of the mosque afterwards. And so essentially Critère felt that the mosque should be created using kind of traditional materials. After it was built, it should be whitewashed with a natural lime plaster, so on and so forth. Well, the problem is that oftentimes these types of construction methods and systems are very expensive. And they also require kind of continuous maintenance. And so what the community wanted to do was rebuild this mosque and then coat it with a layer of cement so it wouldn't require the additional maintenance throughout the year and they could actually save money on it. Well, Critère didn't agree. So the mosque was finished according to what Critère felt was appropriate. And then after Critère left, the community came in and coated it with a cement layer. So it really is, what you see in a lot of communities is difference in priorities. And especially with regards to what constitutes authenticity and who gets to make that decision, right? Is authenticity maintaining a kind of historical rigidity with regards to material, with regards to look, or is authenticity, is it based in what the primary stakeholders of that structure dictate it is? And this is a conversation that you see not only in spaces like West Africa, you also see it in East Africa as well, which has these communities that are known as stone towns, and they're called stone towns because most of the structures are actually built out of coral, and so they have this really kind of beautiful stone appearance. And you have a similar type of situation where UNESCO heritage dictates that these structures should be maintained using these original techniques and materials. But the fact is coral is protected and it's very difficult to get. And it's, there are a lot of problems with using live coral heads to create architecture. So you run into a lot of these tensions, especially in areas where there are differing views of what constitutes appropriate preservation. And I'm sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, I think it's a really fascinating subject, and I would actually like to ask more, but there's some more comments and questions that have come in. Barbara notes that there's a book called Architecture Without Architects that includes many examples of indigenous architecture that ties building to the environment. And Dorothy asks, is there a connection between this mosque and the University of Sankore in Timbuktu?
Yes, so that's actually, so Djenne and Timbuktu are actually sister cities. They both exist along the Niger Bend the Niger River Bend area. And as such, there are a number of structures in Timbuktu, such as the University of Sankore, the Ginger Mosque, oh gosh, what is the other one? I can't believe I'm forgetting it. Anyway, yes. So there are a number of architectural forms that actually arose, I don't want to say simultaneously, but somewhat contemporaneously with spaces like the Djenne Mosque. And they do kind of reflect each other in terms of architectural styles. Yes.
Great, thank you. And Peter asks, how is the roof held up? What is the longest span between columns or between column and wall?
Okay. Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. So the pillars inside are very, very closely set. None of them are more than 1 meter apart squared. And so it creates a very just dense, I don't want to say claustrophobic, but it is a very, very dense space. There are very few, you have lines of sight, but your visibility is very kind of curtailed by the fact that you're kind of in a forest of these very, very dense pillars. Excuse me, so no more than 1 meter apart actually, because that's the only way to maintain structural solvency. And the mosque itself is as tall as a 4-story building. So it's very, yes, that structural stability is key.
So does that create a sense of intimacy in a way? Because you're not in a vast space, you're kind of in a honeycomb space?
Well, it's so I will say that because I'm not Muslim, I have not been inside. And there's actually, so previously the Djenne Mosque actually allowed non-Muslims into the space. But in the past decade, there have been a number of incidents, especially with foreign tourists going into the space and acting inappropriately, that has basically disallowed anyone who is not a Muslim to go into the space. And so a lot of my narrative has come from images, but also talking to people who both conserve the space and who visit it regularly. And interestingly, hearing about the experiences of those people has given me more insight into the structure than I probably ever would have on my own, largely because I probably wouldn't bring the specific cultural and spiritual nuance to the reading of the space. So in terms of how most people describe it, I would probably feel that it was claustrophobic. That being said, most people when they go inside, because your visibility is so constricted, you do feel somewhat in isolation, which in many ways enables prayerful communion better, right? And on top of that, because sound is muffled, light is incredibly dim, you do feel as if you are in a type of envelope, which many people seem to describe as being key to kind of the spiritual experience that they have within the space. So, yeah.
That's really interesting, that aspect of it. And speaking of light, somebody asked how the interior is lighted. Richard asked.
So there are a handful of small window spaces cut out in the surface of the mosque, but they are very few and far between, because the more holes you put in a wall, the more structurally unstable it becomes. So it is an incredibly dimly lit space. Light has historically come from these windows, as well as candles and lanterns placed within the space. More recently, they have actually installed electric lights, much to UNESCO's irritation. But at the same time, UNESCO, they're not the ones using this space. So yes.
Yeah, and I would think that one of the UNESCO things would be as if a heritage space is in continuous use, then it is going to evolve, and it needs to evolve to serve the people it serves, as opposed to being a museum of space, of an object. Thank you. Let's see. Barbara says, I noticed that they use pointed arches, which creates height and brings strength to the roof structure. Are the roofs arched or flat?
The roofs are flat, actually. Yeah. So the arches actually only appear, they're part of the connecting point between the pillars on the inside. Mm-hmm.
And I have a question about termites, because here in the West, we do not worship termites, generally speaking, because we associate them as pests and that they eat wood in our houses and stuff like that. That's my association. So it's a prosaic question, I guess. Do they destroy or damage housing or structures?
Yes, they do. Well, and so just to clarify, so I wouldn't say that termites are necessarily worshipped as gods, but they are seen just through their relevance to kind of the health of a community, both through, kind of protein, the fact that, their earth is actually, although it is used kind of in Mbari structures, it's also used in a number of other kind of architectural capacities. So they have added quite a bit historically to communities, just in terms of these very important areas. And like many communities around the world, when you have kind of a natural source of food and shelter and things like that, they do tend to start occupying something of a, I don't want to say a mythological, but something of a hyper-natural position. And, you know, in our own cultures, we have numerous animals and beings and things like that that occupy similar types of positions. But, you know, that doesn't mean that termites aren't also viewed as pests. I mean, it's not like people go around, you know, not stepping on them. I mean, termites, they destroy roof rafters. They dig holes into earthen walls. They are a pain in the butt for many people, but they're also very useful.
Sure.
And they also
like ants in our culture, they sort of represent industriousness.
oh
But
yeah,
at the same time, you don't want them in your kitchen.
no, absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. So let's see, we have another question about the roof. What sort of material is used for the roof? How waterproof is it? And how about drainage from the roof when it rains?
Okay, so yes, so historically speaking, the roof was made completely of earth. But because the quality of earth has declined so much in recent years, they've actually started reinforcing the roof with wooden rafters. They try to minimize the use of wooden rafters, again, because it goes against authenticity, but they do use them when needed. And in terms of drainage on the roof, typically, so in one of the images that I showed you, specifically of the roof of Djenne, you see individuals on the roof. And so once a day, there are also women who actually come up with brooms and they actually spread any water that has collected on the roof out so it absorbs and it doesn't start creating a crater. There are also small water spouts on the side of the roof that will also allow water to drain as well. And, you know, I would also note too that the only time water is really an issue is during the rainy season. The rainy season is pretty intense, but it is fairly short. And so generally speaking, with intensive maintenance, one can keep the roof sound until it comes time to renovate the mosque again. And they can add additional layers of you know, rafter material if needed. They can unplug these drains and they can start evening out the roof again.
Great, thank you. So, and if with that kind of a short, intense rainy season, I mean, it probably affects every part of their life, you know, lives, because it's just such a huge change in the weather and what they do in their own homes and everything like that. All right. Well, do we have any last questions or comments for the professor today? If you have anything you want to bring up or ask, please do so in the chat form. I think we all are extraordinarily grateful for the multifaceted, multi-connected talk you gave today. I myself loved it. It's got to be one of my favorites now. I'm like, will you do a study tour to Mali for us? So last call, I don't see anything else in the chat, but thank you so much, Professor Apotsos. Thank you, Hope. Thank you, Andy, for being here today, as always. We're very grateful to you for sharing your knowledge and insight with us. And we just want to thank you and wish you the best.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. Take good care. Goodbye, everyone.